Here we go. We're live. That was just in the nick of time getting that light set up. Welcome to those of you watching at home. I'm joined today. This is not a podcast. This is just an impromptu ad hoc conversation between me and my buddy Eric Van Johnson.
Just two friends talking.
Just two friends talking. We haven't done this for, when was it? 2019 was the last time we did this, when I was in Los Angeles for Laracon, trapped in your country. And so what was that? 19. So that's three years ago. And I thought, long overdue. Now we have obviously spoken since then. We've done an episode of North Meets South where we talked about NeoVim and all of that good stuff. But this, for those of people watching who don't know who you are, do you want to just give yourself a quick intro?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Name's Eric Van Johnson. I'm Shokum on Twitter and just about everywhere else because it's just one of those names that nobody gets. Currently my big thing is I'm one of the people behind PHP Architect, the magazine and the upcoming conference, and ideally some training and all sorts of good stuff. I'm really proud of that. John Congdon and I have been running PHP Architect now for a little bit over a year, so big deal for me. And then, of course, I got my PHP Ugly. Ugly. We've been going for, 4 or 5 years. We're well over 300 episodes in. I also happen to do PHP Roundtable, but I really have been a horrible steward of that, and I need to figure that out. So
you say that, yeah. So I think 2016 was around when you started PHP Ugly. I remember you were sitting on a plane with your laptop editing, the same plane as me, just looking over your shoulder, going, "Is that guy? Is that Aussie guy?"
Yeah. I guess that sounds about right, actually. 2016. Yeah. Louisville. Oh, man, those were the best times.
Those are the best. That was the perfect size conference, in my opinion. You can see everyone and speak with everyone, and there's room to breathe, and there's plenty, I mean, Louisville, there wasn't there was plenty to do, but people kind of dispersed a lot more. But the conference hotel was good. The after party was good. That kind of vibe. That's what I always remember of Laracon, and that's what we tried to recreate with Laracon EU. Was that small. We don't want to grow to be too big. New York Times Square Laracon was amazing. Laravel had made it. It was at the PlayStation Theater. It was this massive event, but there's downsides to the massive event, and that's and I know that you're very community focused, and I think maybe you share some of that sort of thought with me. Although tech's quite large, it's multi-track, multi-day, isn't it?
It is, and that, I think that was one of the things that made Louisville so fun for Laracon, was that it was smaller, it's a single track conference, so it just didn't seem that overwhelming to sit in those auditoriums all day and watch talks. Whereas when we got to New York, again, still great speakers, Laracon is still fun, but there's just so many people, and New York is not known for, I'm a big guy, and it's not known for comfort for big guys. So it was, I don't get me wrong, I would never miss a Laracon. If Laracon was, decided to make New York its permanent home, I would still go every year. But there was just something special about Louisville for me in the couple of years I went. And like you said, I don't think there was an official conference hotel, but everybody seemed to stay at the same hotel, or most of the people did. So you would see people down in the bar or eating, some dinner or something. So yeah, that to me was like the sweet spot of conferences.
Yeah, and hopefully, we see the return to that. But you never know what the plans are. We'll have to see what unfolds next year. But it's good to see. Laracon EU came back this year. Laracon India is having its inaugural event next year. Taylor has said Laracon US is coming back. Laracon AU, we're in very early discussions to bring that back next year as well. So it's it's been a slog, and I've missed it, not having it, but have been grateful for the opportunity to spend more time with my family and not have to worry about that, which I spoke about on the last north meets south. But this is, as the title of the video says, we're going to talk about using value objects in Laravel, and this is something that I know that you've been speaking about on the past few episodes of PHP Ugly in terms of how you're leveraging value objects in event sourcing. Jake and I spoke about it on the last North Meets South because he's been looking to use value objects to kind of encapsulate and consolidate business logic and validation logic throughout his application. And we kind of went down the path of discussing when that's appropriate, at what level you're kind of doing your validation versus, like what the value object should actually be responsible for.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we'll get into a little bit of the delineation between a value object and a data transfer object, and when you might want to use one or the other.
Sure.
So, I mean, my perspective is that I've used data transfer objects. I know of value objects, but I haven't really used them a lot in practice. But my understanding is when you're the main differentiation between a DTO, data transfer object, and a value object and a VO is that the data transfer object kind of does some very basic type checking. It'll make sure that, a string is a string, an integer is an integer, a float's a float. Whereas a value object would have some enforcement, some validation around what those actual values are. So in the context of, for example, an age object is one that I saw on, I think it was Matthias Novak's blog, which I have a link to in the video notes, was, an age cannot be less than 0. So you're validating the integrity of that value object by putting in some rules around it of what the value itself what makes the value of that value object valid. There's a lot of vals there. Whereas like business logic might sit in a layer outside that uses the value objects that you already know have valid values in them.
Mm-hmm.
So have I got that right? Is that kind of the right track?
Yeah, real close. And I listened to, was it yesterday you guys recorded that? Yesterday's show? Were you
It
talking about
came out
value?
yesterday, yeah.
I thought you guys did a fantastic job, by the way. I just wanted to put that out there.
Thanks.
So before we get too far into this, I really feel obligated to say I am nowhere near a subject matter expert on this. I mean, I am literally learning this as I go along, and I kind of stumbled onto this as I was doing event sourcing. I was introduced to value objects, and value objects is a very common thing in domain-driven development.
Mm-hmm.
And so is event sourcing. So I kind of stumbled onto it, and I really latched onto it. So I'm definitely not saying value object all the things. Not today, anyways. Nobody needs to go and change their conference talk denouncing the benefits of value objects. I'm not gonna name names. I have too much respect for Matt Stauffer to do that. But so to your point, I think I'm the reverse, right? I kind of have a recursive knowledge of DTOs, haven't really used them. And of course, value objects I have been getting into lately. So my understanding of it is, well, first off, I think one of the biggest differentiators between a value object and a DTO is that a value object will actually have logic inside of it, where it can actually do things, checks and stuff like that. A DTO doesn't really do that, right? It doesn't really have logic inside of it. And the way I see DTOs is a DTO's responsibility is more along the lines of normalizing the data that's coming into your system. So let's say, for example, you're consuming a certain type of API, but you're consuming it from different services. And the way that it's presenting those APIs back to you might not be consistent. Right. And that's where the value object, the DTO comes into play. The DTO says, okay, I'll take in all these strings. I'm going to normalize this for what I need in my application. So value objects, again, the biggest thing is they have logic in there. And the the thing that took me back a little bit. So I assume you watched Laracon online, right?
I've seen a few talks here and there. Yeah,
Did you see Taylor's talk?
I did see Taylor's talk. Yeah.
Taylor started talking about this, introducing this new invocable custom rules,
Mhm.
right? Fantastic, right? If you look at that talk and what he does with that invocable custom rule, that's basically a value object. I
Right.
mean, obviously, a value object isn't invocable, but that's what it is. You're saying a value object has no identity. It doesn't. What makes up a value object's identity is the sum of its parts. So what, the characteristics of a value object is actually what makes up its identity. So you define that. And when I first stumbled upon this, onto this, it was introduced to me, obviously. I thought to myself, I'm like, this is crazy. Like, I don't want to hold the hand of every piece of data that's coming into my system and do all this crazy stuff to it.
Mhm.
But as I started thinking about it, it's like, oh yeah, by doing value objects, I no longer have to validate things, right? Which
Right.
is a weird concept.
Yeah.
That's one of those examples where I'm like on the fence. Like the Laravel developer in me still wants to validate those request objects that come in, but as a value object, you don't have to do that. And so the value object just base it's the definition of that object. So if it's an age object, like you said, you can define, the age can't be, depending on your utilization of it, can't be under 21, let's say, right?
Right. Yep.
And definitely can't be over 150, right?
Mhm.
And you can add all this stuff to it, but you can also, multiple things can make up a value object. So like if you want a value object, an address value object, right? That's easily enough done, right?
Mhm.
You just pass in the stuff, and just because it's a value object, you don't lose not only the ability to have access to the individual components. So like in the case of an address, you would pass like a street, a city, a state, a postal code,
Yep.
right? And my initial thought was, well, then I'm losing my access to those things, right? But that's not the case. You
Yeah.
just, in your value object, you basically set getters. You say, hey, you know, here's the street, here's the city,
Mhm.
state. Now, the one of the most important things with DTOs and value objects is they're immutable.
Right. Yep.
So they cannot be changed. If you need to, let's take for example, currency, right? You have the USD, US dollar, and EU, and you initiate a value object where it just assumes USD by default, and later in your application, you're like, oh no, I want to convert that to EU.
Mhm.
You can't do that within the same value object. You basically have to scrap that value
Mhm.
object and do it again, right?
Right.
So, so yeah, I mean, that's like it was a weird concept, but the more I worked with it, the more it just felt so clean in my code.
Mm.
And um, now there is this other kind of side effect, and I've been talking a lot about how I've been using invocable controllers like crazy. That's like my new thing. I love invocable controllers, and again, this is coming out of this whole domain-driven kind of philosophy of everything needs to be its own individual component that's testable,
Mhm.
and value objects are kind of an extension of that. But the problem you end up with is all of a sudden you have what feels like clutter. You have all these additional files,
Right.
right? But again, with value objects, you're using it to type in your variables, and it's frustrating when you watch a lot of the videos because I've done like a lot of research on it. You watch a lot of these videos on the benefits of value objects, and the one thing I think a lot of them don't touch on often is, as developers, we actually really do lose sight of the actual value of variables, right?
Right.
So, we make a lot of assumptions that we understand what state a variable is at a certain place within our application. With value objects, that's no longer an issue. You're always just type hinting. You always know, not only is it not just an integer, but it's a positive integer between 21 and 150, or whatever the rules you defined for it were, whatever the validations you defined for it were. You know that you have this concrete understanding of, I know this is an age value now, so I know this. There's no guessing. I can't tell you how many times I've used Xdebug to step through code only to find out what I made the assumption, or what I thought a variable was, turned out to be something else because I had overwritten it somewhere and I wasn't paying attention.
Yeah.
And value objects really help protect you from that.
Yeah, and this string, passing primitives around and things like that makes it a little bit easier to run into those issues where, as you say, when you're typing value objects and you're passing real objects around, it makes it much easier to sort of look at the method signature and know that you've got the right thing there. Like, you can't pass the wrong thing into that method. And people listening to this know that for the longest time I didn't use types, no return types, but the more that I'm sort of progressing, and the newer versions of PHP, the more modern versions of PHP from like 7.4 onwards, and especially 8 and now 8.1, really make this a much more powerful thing. And then with the static analysis tools that are built into your editors, it just makes it much more difficult to let these accidental things kind of slip into your code. And this this kind of brings up then that using the value objects, passing them around, you mentioned that you would have accesses. Well, PHP 8.1 gives you the read-only properties now as well. So you can you can pass these things in, you can make them public so that they're readable from the outside, but they can't be changed directly. And so that's really useful. The other thing that I find really useful is like a name object. You could have a name object that takes a string first name and a string last name. And it's in the title card of like this video, that you can give it a toString method and you can just print that thing and it will print first name space last name. You can do all of this kind of stuff. With the addresses, you can format them and pass them around, knowing that the object is stringable because it's got an interface to do that, or it's got a toString method. And you know that the formatted value is going to fit based on the inputs. You know that the inputs are going to be valid because you enforce that within the constructor. And so, these kinds of, and you mentioned, bringing stuff in from different endpoints. Well, this is what we're doing at work. We're integrating with different lenders, like financial lenders, and they've all got their own APIs, and they've all got their own, constructs around what this looks like. And so for me, what I'm trying to do at the moment is to kind of look at how we can normalize that, so that at the moment we've got X number of lenders, but over the next 6-12 months, we want to integrate with, X times, some exponential number of lenders. And if we can get the core right, that we're passing these things around internally such that we can just, look at the integration and we can have a mapping, knowing that we have an object that looks like this, how do we map that to this particular lender? And using value objects to do this makes it much easier to say, like, to lender X, to lender Y, or wrapping it up like lender from, value object and things like that. And so having enforcement of those things and then being able to reference it, because what we do currently, which is what we like the royal we, the PHP community at large, what we've been doing for a long time, is passing associative arrays around, and then you've got keys in there, and accessing these things by keys, you're prone to typos. typos then lead to exceptions, undefined indexes, all of this kind of stuff that you might not catch necessarily in testing. So the combination of the value object with the type properties, with like real properties on a real object, means that it's not impossible, but it's much more difficult to have a typo, because you're just scrolling through a list in your IDE. It's like, yeah, I need this thing. But then formatting is consistent. If one lender system is in what do they call it, title case, capital first letter and then small everything else, but you're expected to have everything in uppercase, well, that can then become a concern of your value object. That every time you call to upper, it's going to give you the address formatted all in uppercase in a consistent format everywhere. And that also then gives you one place to kind of focus on formatting, trimming extra white space, handling, someone passed in a null or an empty string or just a single space character. And all of those things can get converted to like a null and then stripped out in your output, because that, a null, an empty string, or a space on its own is, it's an empty-ish value. And so you just discard it all in your formatting. And that helps you consolidate all of that stuff. Yes, you still have sort of your request level validation to make sure that you're getting something valid into your system. And then rather than passing a request object around or an associative, request arrow only in the Laravel context, and passing an array of these things around, you would say address from request, and you would throw the request at it, and then that you get a request in, so that you can access all of these things. You can then so this is then the from request then becomes a static constructor or a named constructor, however you want to name it. And then it knows, okay, well, I'm going to pull this value from the request. So you can just do request whatever, and then instantiate your object that way, and then spit that back out, knowing that, okay, now we've got this thing that we can pass around internally. The DTOs, I think the main thing, DTOs are like your boundary level objects. You want to convert to a DTO as soon as something comes into your application and just before it leaves your application. And I think that's generally where I've been most comfortable. We had an integration a few months ago where there was a documented specification for what this request payload would look like. And so I wrote a parser. I didn't write the objects myself. I wrote a parser to take the specification and generate like PHP objects, DTOs, based on that specification, which meant that it was specification compliant. It had to be, because it read the spec and it generated the code accordingly. And then from there, everything was like to notify. So the company I call is called Notify. So I have a method that's enforced by an interface. It's called to notify. It's a notifiable. And all that means is that I can recursively from the top DTO all the way down the tree, call to notify. It'll go, does this implement notifiable? Okay, call to notify on that all the way down until I get this array, which I can then throw at the database. And so like having that kind of enforcement means that I can test the individual DTOs, or you can test the individual value objects, and know that the behaviors of those objects are always correct at the unit level, such that when you're testing your controller endpoints, all you need to do is say, given this request, this is what and I don't even bother checking what's in the database necessarily. I just say, okay, given this payload for an application, I expect there to be an application record. I expect there to be 2 people, 3 addresses, 2 occupancies, 1 loan record, and whatever else. Assuming even, and you know what they say about assumptions, but because we have the test of the objects themselves, we know that as long as those records are there, what's going to be in the database is valid. You don't, and so this gives you, a very high level feature test that broadly speaking the system works, but also at a very, very fine level that the individual objects will always present correctly when they're asked for their like to database representation. And so you get like these multiple, and this is, Adam Wathen's spoken about it before in terms of, outside in testing. And Jeffrey's spoken about it before in terms of like programming by wishful thinking and all of that kind of stuff, where, you know, this is the API that I want to exist. So I write the test for it, and then I go and back it up and go, okay, this is the feature, but hang on, we need to go and like enforce this logic internally. And that's where you then go and write a unit test for the value object that says, given I give it these inputs for my address, and I call toString or toFormatted string or whatever, I get this exact thing back out. And that way, if you ever come across like a different format coming into your system or something that you didn't account for, you only ever really need to write the test for the input. Say like, given this input, right, it needs to look like this in the output in my toFormatted address or toString or whatever. And then I write the test for that and know that all the rest of it is still going to work, because from the feature level, all I'm doing is calling toAddress and knowing that, you know, that bug is fixed there. The rest of it all just clicks into place. Makes for much more robust systems, much more comprehensively tested systems, and much more reliable systems. And I think, you know, that's where these kind of things, especially in bigger applications, provide a lot more durability, maintainability, and like, it's a whole process. You know, our application has been built, you know, over a number of years, and so there's like, you know, old habits die hard kind of thing. There's all of these array access and like, even to this day, we're fixing things where we're accessing nested keys, and sometimes that key is not set, and so we're getting exceptions. And so, you know, the fix now in modern versions of PHP is just question mark null. You know, that thing doesn't exist. But if we're using value objects, we know the thing exists. It had to exist when the object was created, and I think that's where we kind of get that extra level of security in what we're building, and knowing that we're getting exactly what we're expecting, you know, 99% of the time. And in that particular part of the system that I'd built, you know, a few months ago, because it's all based on DTOs, because it's tested from the outside in and the inside out and whatever else, I very rarely see any issue. And it helps that we have a documented specification, because it means that we're always receiving something that's compliant. And the only time that we ever really see any issue with it is when we get like a non-compliant response or a request coming, and we go, well, that's a you thing. You know, we don't have to go and fix it. So I've heard about them in the past. I've dreamt about using them, but, you know, unless you have the time to put in the concerted effort to actually switch to it, you know, and like, it's easy to see, right? It's easy to see the benefits. It's just when there's, you know, working legacy systems that are generating money, that need new features to, you know, move your business forward, these kinds of things kind of slip by the wayside. So,
well, I think that's one of the benefits of value objects. The bar of entry is actually really low, right? Because you can just decide, hey, I want to start using these. You don't have to use them everywhere
right.
in your system, and you don't have to define them. And they're so easy. They're so easy to create and maintain. So you can just say, okay, I'm defining this address value object, and then you just start implementing it in the system where you see fit, when you see fit, and have it be this gradual thing.
Yeah.
The other thing you talked about, so what I'm doing with the event sourcing stuff, it's really just an API backend, right? But you touched on the concept of formatting, that like the toString thing, and that's one of the things that I'm looking forward to kind of exploring more, because it seems to me like with value objects, an address is a great example. Actually, you can have a toString where the address is all on one line. You can have a toBlock where it's the block, you know, the address is in a block form. Maybe you want to store your address in the database in JSON format, so you have a toJSON sort of format for it. That just makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
One of the things I don't know yet if it's correct as far as doing value objects. So you definitely never write to your database within a value object.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the role of a value object. And the problem with that is you could introduce change to that object, right? So you never write to the database. But I feel like as I'm doing my validations, I should be able to read from the database. So let's say I want to make sure something's unique, right?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like, but I haven't quite locked that in my head. Like, do am I able to say, like if I have a user object and am I able to say confidently within my application that, hey, I want to make sure this user's email address is unique. So I want to look at the database. And I know I can use in the Laravel world, I can use my user model because that's where my email is located. And I feel like that should be an acceptable, step for validating that object. But I don't know yet. That's one of those things there. I just haven't worked with it. I haven't talked to enough people who've worked with them to say, oh yeah, it's perfectly normal to look at a database, to read from a database, to validate things within your object. I don't know.
Yeah, and this is like the kind of gray area that I got into with Jake, is that the value object itself, to my understanding, should be self-validating in that the value that it encapsulates is correct for what you expect that to be. So the assumption based on that is that the validation of whether or not the user exists already happens before the value object is instantiated. So that, and that's, and this is where it kind of gets a little bit blurry with Laravel, is because you've got the notion of like these active records, right? In terms of your user model is both a representation of a record in your database, but also the gateway to access the database. And so the assumption being that you have already validated the uniqueness of that email address as part of your request. And so once you get past it, because this all happens, earlier in the request lifecycle, so that by the time you hit your controller method, you know that the user is already unique. You can now take that value and create a user value object. So that's that thing. The other, where you say, you're not writing to the database, in case it wasn't clear from what, like with this notifiable, this toNotify method, it's returning an array that maps the value object properties to the corresponding database fields. And so, and then what I end up doing there is, I would create a user. I'd have $user arrow addresses arrow create, and then I would have $address arrow toNotify, and that would then be the create object. So you can see it's, and then it becomes very terse in your controllers. You can see what's happening, but if you want to see what that mapping looks like, you just follow that toNotify method or that toDatabase method or whatever whatever else you're wanting to do in that regard. And so that, like, I feel that's given me a good balance in terms of like encapsulating what the shape of the data, the schema, versus then separating kind of the Laravel side and the business, like the domain logic side of things. And that that's kind of where I see the two kind of differentiated in terms of DTO and value object, and how that happens. So I mean, you say that typically a DTO wouldn't have methods, but I mean, I've put them on there, and it's the DTO has kind of become a value object, like this dual, like the Laravel data thing that Jake and I spoke about, the Sparsy package that kind of does all of this kind of stuff where it blurs the lines because it is a DTO, but it's also a value object, but it also, and that's kind of the world we live in, There is the purity of having a DTO and a value object, but are you really going to, in a practical sense, convert a request coming into your application from JSON to a DTO and then convert the DTO to a value object? I mean, theoretically you should, I guess. Practically, you probably won't. I mean, I certainly don't. I feel, you're already doing enough to sort of, I mean, you could go value object static, value object : from DTO if you really wanted to add that extra level of, separation. But I don't think it's necessary in that regard. But it depends on what you're doing. Because we then also have the notion of like converting request payloads in that DTO to other like it handles converting if we get nested DTOs where like a person has an address. Well, the address is not just like a string, it's now an address DTO, and then so that object gets passed in there. And so you've got this layering of DTOs where, everything, and this is where it comes back to like that toNotify method will spin through recursively, looking at every single property and then through each one of those all the way to the end. So I'm just eyeballing this blog post from Matthias that basically says DTOs should only be used in two places: where data enters or when data leaves the application. Some examples. When a controller receives the post request, the request data may have any shape. We need to go from shapeless data to data with a schema with verified keys and types, and we use a DTO for this. A form library may be able to populate this DTO based on submitted form data, or we can use a serializer to convert the plain text request body to a populated DTO. Right, I think we've covered that. I've also used it on the way out. When we make a HTTP post request to a web service, we may collect the input data into a DTO first and then serialize it to a request body, spit out some JSON that our HTTP client can run, can then send to the service. And like Laravel makes that easy. You pass this DTO that you've generated from something, you call to JSON on it and shove it straight in, or to array and shove it straight into the HTTP facade. For queries, for GET requests, same thing, in and out. But a value object is used wherever you want to verify that a value matches our expectations and we don't want to verify it again. So this is like rather than passing a string email address around and then having to check it everywhere, because there may be multiple entry points to some like distant part of your application that requires an email address. And so you don't want to have to validate it at all of those layers to account for like not knowing where the email address came from. If you say like at this point I need an email address, it's the top levels that kind of say, okay, well I'm going to create an email address, because that by the time it gets to that method, it is already a valid email address. It can't be anything else. So you don't have to do that. And so that's the example. If we have an email address value object, we know that the value has been verified to look like a valid email address, so we don't have to check it again in other places. And you can do that for we can also add methods to the object that extract, for instance, the username or the host name from the email address. They're often used in domain models because guarantees or invariants are an important part of their business, but they can be used anywhere in an application, since every part of the application will need ways to centralize some rules, provide evidence of correctness, and accumulate related behaviors. So I think like that. I think that kind of there's still the blurring of the lines, and as I said, in a Laravel context, I think validating like whether something exists in the database or whether it's unique or that the data is provided, like that's not important. I think we kind of get a little bit murky is where you may either get into the situation where you're validating the data twice, once at the request level and then once within the context of the value object, and that's going to depend on where you can instantiate the value object, for the age, right? If you're saying, if you're creating like a new record in your application and you require that your users be over 21, you would probably do that at the request level, but you would probably also do that at the value object level to enforce that requirement, because you may be able to instantiate a value object somewhere else in the system, like from the command line, for example, where you might have an artisan command to create a user, which may not use the request, the validation logic, but you still need to make sure that the user is at least 21 years old. So that's where, and I don't think that duplication is a bad thing. It's just providing some guarantees around the data. Where you might get some funniness is where something passes a piece of validation logic, and then you go to instantiate the value object and the value object spits the dummy over that. But Laravel kind of makes that easier anyway, because you can just rather than throwing generic exceptions or whatever, you can just say like validation exceptions, or throw validation exception with message, and let that just bubble up to the HTTP layer and go from there. So there are some options there.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting if there are perspectives on that, to see what other people think about it.
Yeah. And I think so. Another aspect of this, at least for me, and again, I could still be using it wrong. I don't know, but the value objects just become part of my normal type hinting of the stuff I'm using. And so I'm not typing inits or strings anymore, right? The it should have more, whatever I'm working with should have more meaning than that. So everywhere I would normally type in a string, let's say for an email address, I'm typing email.
Yep.
As the, because that's what the value object is. You did touch on, I don't actually remember what triggered this, but the concept of, I call them nested value objects. So again, like the address example, my zip code might actually be its own value object that I would use inside my address value object.
Yeah.
And that's where I try to, I worry that it will get away from me. Like I will get too granular with that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm still kind of working out what the rules are there. Like what when do I say, okay, this is going to become its own value object because whatever reason.
Yeah. And kind of where do you draw the line? Like how much do you name them versus, when do you start getting generic? Is age enough, or does it have to be like age of consent, or, all of that kind of stuff? That they might all extend from a common ancestor. You could have age as the base, but then age of consent extends from age and things like that. And really all that's doing is overriding the validation or the constructor. So I've said it, like I've tweeted about it before, and I don't know that we're ever going to see it in PHP, but it'd be nice if we started to see some primitive objects in PHP, string, integer, float, these kinds of things, where you've got then methods that you can call on the objects, which is, Laravel string help is really nice in that regard, that you can do like string of, and then you can chain methods on it to manipulate the string and things like that. Like it'd be nice to have that at a language level, just so that it's consistent and it's available everywhere. But it's neither here nor there. But it gives you that kind of enforcement, across the board, that your age would always extend from the integer, which would bubble down in through the application, and then you get some implicit validation there, kind of thing.
Right. I have to say, like value objects for me are one of those things you can't unsee. I feel like value objects are one of those things that like really good developers have been using forever and just haven't been telling us other scrubs that are trying to grudge our way through coding. Is like, oh hey, by the way, there's this really cool thing you can do, and you're working too hard at this. Just think more simplistic. So yeah, I can't stress enough. Value objects are one of those things where I'm like, why didn't I know about this? Like I had known about it. Honestly, I had heard about value objects for years, and it just never registered. It's like, well, why would you use this? How would you? It just didn't ever really make sense until I started doing it, and then I'm just like, I'm such an idiot. Like, how have I not been using this whole entire time?
Yeah, and value, like the Laravel community especially goes through these waves of, like, we had repository pattern and we did like hexagonal architecture. Shout out to Chris Fidel, who loves that so much. All these different things that kind of come and go, and people come in, they're new to the ecosystem, and they're like, wow, the repositories are the best thing ever. And it's like, well, you probably don't need it, kind of thing. But value objects are the kind of thing that are useful enough and lightweight enough that you can use them anywhere, especially with like large globs of unstructured, schemaless data, requests that come into your application, especially requests that come into your application from somewhere else. Being able to safely pass these things around, knowing that they are valid everywhere from, the very boundary of your application right up until you shove them in a database is incredibly useful. And then, all of the developer experience things that we go on about, the type hinting, the completion, the, being able to kind of ensure, mitigate against typos and like not rookie mistakes, but just like, errors that you
Yeah.
don't need to have in your application, because you can protect yourself from that.
I think this was one of the concepts behind enums as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, why are we not doing this? Exactly what you said. We don't need to create these classes with these constants. Let's just create these enums, not worry about mistyping things, not worry. And enums play nicely with value objects, right? You're either type hinting a value object or you can be type hinting an enum.
Yeah.
It's very, very slick. I enjoy it. And you're wrong. You should always use a repository pattern. Nobody listened to Dorinda or anybody else who says they're not good. No, yeah, I think I do think that there could, there arguments could be made to when and why you wouldn't use a repository pattern. But I think there are a lot fewer arguments to not using value objects. Like I honestly can't think of a good argument not to use a value object. I'm sure there are some out there, but I don't know what they are right now.
Mm-hmm. Yep, for sure. I think, and like you say, they're easy to kind of bring in, and like use them in places. When you have to go in and add a new piece of functionality. Okay, well let's draw a line in the sand. Let's start using it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, if you're working in a project by yourself, it's like it's easier to do that. If you've got to drag a team along with you, you've got to make sure that everyone's on board. That like we're drawing the line in the sand, and for anything new, we want to start doing this. So
and that holds true to anything, right? Any kind
of
testing, any concept. It's like that. You just have to make that decision, and it's an education process. You explain why you're doing it, what the benefits are, and you just kind of enforce it in PRs moving forward. You look at where, oh, hey, we could have made this a value object, or, oh, by the way, we have a value object for this. Can you go create that? And it just all kind of naturally starts to fix itself.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
cool. All right.
This was fun, man.
I think, it was good. It's, I've always, liked the idea of these, not throwaway, but just like sitting down and talking through a solution. Because like doing this kind of stuff on Twitter always ends poorly. People jump in, they start flinging, everywhere, and being able to just sit down and hash something out and talk through the pros and cons and get, to a good place in the end is always nice. So I appreciate taking the time on short notice. There will be no show notes. There will be no link in the... Well, actually, there's a few links in the description. There's the Matthias Novak's article, which is actually quite recent. September 13th, he posted this. Is it a DTO or a value object? And also there was a video that you sent me yesterday, which was on the PHP Architect website, which we've linked to, which goes through that kind of stuff as well. So yeah, definitely check those out. If you have any questions or comments or anything like that. Adrian Nürnberger, just before we go, he has said, how many value objects do you have in a big project versus how many models are in there? And how often are you using the value objects in like for a user, for example? The user is the user, but the user might encapsulate like an email address value object and a name value object and things like that. And so I think from my point of view, I think you would almost always have more value objects than you're going to have models. And I think
that would make sense to me.
Yeah, right. And I think, the model is always going to encapsulate the value object most of the time. There might be situations where you might have a value object that encapsulates a model. I know, I think it was on your Discord, I think it was A Woods maybe, was talking about this in terms of the identity. Oh no, Dimitri. was talking about this, like an identity that encapsulates a few different pieces. Like that kind of thing may be where you end up encapsulating your models inside of value objects. But I think it's far less common, in my opinion.
Yeah. Now, to kind of answer that question, and I'm new to value objects. The application I'm working on is a greenfield application. It's not a huge application, and my value objects to models, I think it's looking like a 3-to-1, 4-to-1, where I have 4 value objects in to every model. Now, that's not a direct. Oh, because I have a model, I'm going to have 4 value objects. I'm just saying, I use a lot more value objects than I do models.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you'll definitely use a lot more value objects. And again, they're cheap, they're easy to make. It's really almost, I don't want to say it's a set it and forget it sort of thing, but you don't, once you create it, you don't go in there and tinker it with it a lot. It's just defining your validation rules, and maybe you come up with a new validation rule, which you got to be careful doing because data that's already traveled through there might not have meant it. But that doesn't change. As developers, we always run that risk, right?
Yeah. That is an interesting consideration. Validation, validation rules changing. You'd have to be, as you say, careful of existing data in the system, especially stuff that's like already in the database that gets pulled out and converted to a validation, a value object that could warrant a little bit more thought.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
So yeah, and you mentioned it, PHP Architect. We've been trying to post a few more educational videos to our YouTube channel, trying to get some traction there. So go check that out. We have PHP Tech coming next year, 2023. We've signed the contract. Tech.phparch.com. That's phparch.com.
And Tech
go
is
there.
TEK.
We have call for papers open. If you have talks you want to submit your talks. We're running blind early bird right now, so that basically means you can buy a ticket, not knowing exactly who's going to talk or not knowing the speakers, because we haven't gone through them yet. But it's also the cheapest the price is going to be. All that's available now. We're really excited about Tech 2023. It's going to be in Chicago, and give it a look. Give PHP Architect, the magazine, a look. Monthly release. We have digital and print. There's
Perfect.
nothing better. Check it out. This is quality stuff, man. I'm pimping stuff here. This is quality stuff. I've always loved getting the physical copy of PHP Architect, and I've been a subscriber. I just looked at this. As a matter of fact, I wrote next month's editorial. And I started subscribing to PHP Architect like 6 months after they started releasing. And I wasn't even a professional PHP developer back then. I just enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the quality of the magazine and the article. So give it a look. We're trying to get more Laravel stuff in there. So we pay for contributors. If you want to write a feature article for us, we will pay you. Just reach out to us and let us know.
Amazing. All right. Thanks for coming on. Hope everything goes well with Tech. I know it's as a conference organizer myself, I know it is an extremely large undertaking, and not one that people. That's why they happen once a year. It's just getting sponsors and speakers and accommodation and lanyards and shirts and all that stuff. Like it's a thing. But kudos to you on blocking the last one out of your memory and trying to do it again. And
you as well.
Yeah. Fortunately, I've got the powerhouse Laravel brand behind me, so makes it a little bit easier. But yeah, thanks to those of you that stuck around and watched. I'll probably spruik this on Twitter as well through the week. And if you have any comments, or if you want to tell us how wrong we are, or how right we are, or how close we got to being right, hit us up on Twitter. I'm at Michael Drenda, Eric's at Shokum, and I don't know, I'll see people the next time I do one of these things. Bye.
Deuces.